table na natin makaakyat yung mga bata. This has been a very challenging week for all of us. I think the magnitude of the disaster that we just experienced is really unheard of. It's something that we as a people and as a nation has never encountered. So I believe that all of us are still in that kind of a mood wherein we are both saddened at the same time. We're looking for ways by which we can help, we can do something for our fellow men. So my topic for today is on stewardship, okay? And as we will find out later, as I was sort of preparing this message and the title came, I was asking what's the significance of all of my topic to the situation that we are in. But I soon realized that I believe what I'm going to be talking about, or at least what the word reveals, will be something of importance, and I think it's going to be very applicable. Stewardship is basically the responsible management of anything entrusted to one's care. Okay? And for our passage today, let's open our Bibles to Luke 16. Before we go there, Luke 15, and the chapter before, talks about the prodigal son, which is a very popular story or parable. And followed that is Luke 15, and it talks about the topic we'll be dealing with today. We have to understand that as we read the Bible, there are no chapters in the original way it was written. So I think we need to keep that in mind because it helps us understand what we are going to be talking about. Of the other synoptic gospel writers, Matthew and Mark, Luke was the last one to write his account of Jesus' life, which was around 95 AD. So when Luke wrote this, Christ has already been gone for at least 95 years past. Luke was a physician, and because of his training and attention to details, he is considered a very good historian. And as you know, he has the longest gospel account. He also was the one who wrote the book of Acts, which is basically a historical account after Jesus' death on the works of the apostles. Though there are similarities among the gospel writers, how Luke arranged his materials is sometimes very different from that of Matthew or Mark. This is because Luke's main audience were the Gentile readers, not Jews in particular. So, may nakapasok na yan. So there are things that to the Jew it's well understood, and to the Gentile it's also well understood. Our problem is that we don't exactly know what the cultural context back then that makes the reading of the Gospel so easy. Sometimes there are things that are very difficult to understand. Luke 16 is one of those. Luke 16 contains two related parables. One is about the shrewd manager, which will be our primary concern, and following that, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. They both touch on stewardship, as we will see. So let's go first to the parable of the shrewd manager. What is a parable? It is basically a simple story, maybe fiction and not actual or true story, that is used to illustrate a moral or spiritual lesson or truth. As told by Jesus in the Gospels, That's the way he uses to illustrate truth from a purely human experience stories. Parables are a popular way for ancient rabbis to hold an audience's attention while illustrating an important moral point. Stories have a way of gripping us, gripping our attention, and this is the way parables are usually told. Okay, here we go. Okay, this is now the parable of the shrewd manager, Luke 16, starting with verse 1. Jesus told his parables. There was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. We see that Jesus is the one speaking and relating the parable to his disciples. So his audience is primarily the disciples. Okay, so let's try to imagine that he was basically talking with his disciples. His parable or story is about a rich man who delegated or given the supervision of his possessions or his business to his manager. As a manager, he can basically do whatever he wants. Okay, the owner basically gives the whole authority to the manager, and the manager just runs the property, the possessions, the business, what he may have there, as he wants. Okay, so he stands in place of the manager. The manager doesn't have to know anything about what the owner doesn't have to know anything about what the manager is doing, so long as he takes care of the property and gains a certain profit from it. Okay? Profit is important for the owner. So the manager is like a trusted accountant. You don't give all of your possessions to somebody you cannot trust. So the premise is this: manager is trustworthy. However, a problem develops, and we see that in that first part of verse 1, manager was accused of wasting his possessions. The implication is that instead of the owner profiting from his wealth, the owner instead lost because of the manager acting dishonestly. Okay? He not only got the profit he deserved, he lost. Okay, I mean, that was the problem of the owner. He should have gotten some profit, and not only that, it seems like he wasted his possessions. He lost a lot. It could be that the manager gained while the owner himself did not. He may in reality be stealing from his master. He didn't deserve the trust given him, for he didn't really care much for his master's interest. In other words, he is what we might call an unprofitable servant. So verse 2 now, so he called him and asked, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer." So when the rich man heard and got the report, he confronted and really confronted the manager and said, "Okay, pakita mo sa akin lahat ng listahan ng mga hari-harian ko, kung anong ginawa mo, lahat ipakita mo sa akin, lalo na yung mga utang o kung ano naman yan." So the owner basically want now to know the day-to-day operations and how his property or his possessions was run. Now he wanted to know the details, whereas before he didn't need to know. Now he wanted. Just to say, prior to the manager producing the books or records, the owner has already sentenced him to be terminated. We need to understand that the manager, okay, was already dismissed by the owner, because you cannot be manager any longer. So there was a problem here's the problem for the manager. Being a manager of a wealthy master, let's imagine how this works, because if you're a manager of a very wealthy person, chances are you will also be paid a sizable amount of money. Okay? And because of your status, for example, you become a CEO of a certain company, you basically are paid very well, you are considered someone in the community, you associate with the upper class, and you have such a very good standing. And then people will come to you and you have a very good reputation because you are rich. Okay? That's the position. This position made him the person to go to if one needed to borrow money or anything in kind like oil or grain, which are the daily essentials of the poor peasants back then. Now he's being fired. Okay, so imagine if you were the manager, you're being fired, but what's the first thing you need to think about? How he's going to survive, or how he's going to survive economically when his job is no longer available. Okay? So that was his concern. He's not fit to do manual or physical labor because that was not his real work to start with. And he is too proud to beg. Okay? And this is in verse 3. What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. So think of a CEO, and in CEO, say for example, a very big corporation, isipin niya, ako pwedeng maging construction worker na didig dyan sa kali-kali, and I'm ashamed to beg. Which means that his status is really, really very high. Okay? That is important to notice. So in verse 4, I know what I'll do. Parang biglang meron siyang naisip. Okay? Baga alam niyo yung parang aha. Right? We have that aha moment. Or kung minsan yung may, alam niyo sa cartoon, may ilaw na bulb. Kumbaga, ting! Deho. Okay? Something like that. So his solution to the problem is to survive something that will gain him favor before the eyes of his borrowers. So, look at this. When I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. This is a very important phrase that I want you to just carry with you, because that is, I think, a very important point to the whole story. Okay? So he intends to do something that will sort of make him appear good to the borrowers. So again, there's the owner, here's the manager, and here are the borrowers. So these are the three people basically in this story. In verse 5 now, so he called in each one of his master's debtors. He asked first, how much do you owe my master? I owe the master 500 gallons of olive oil. So you can just imagine just the sheer amount. Okay, 500 gallons of oil. It seems of olive oil, 900 gallons of olive oil means to say na either napakatagal na umuutang at umuutang ng mga taong nagmamanage yung manager, or medyo talagang, you can just imagine maybe, I'm not sure if this is like using hyperbole, or maybe an exaggerated quantity of Jesus Christ, the way he said it. But anyway, medyo malaki yung utang. So he replied, the manager told him, ganito gawin mo. Asan yung original na kasulatan? Tanggalin mo yan, ulitin mo na yan, at sulat mo kalahati na lang. So instead of 900, gawin mo na lang 450. Okay? So, ganun din ang ginawa niya sa pangalawa. Then he asked the second, and how much do you owe? 1,000 bushels of wheat. Iniinad yun. Ilang bang 1 bushel? Ano nangyari? Bakit nakaputang niya ng ganun karami to the point na hindi na tuloy nakakapagbayad yung mga tao. So you see, there's this kind of a problem in the way it was managed, really. He told him, so 1,000 bushels of wheat, sabihin na natin ilang kilo ng bigas, halimbawa, or ilang sako ng bigas, sabihin na natin, kalahating truck ng bigas. Something like that. He told him, take your bill and make it 800. So yung una, 50% off. Yung pangala, 20% off. Okay? So, ang laki bawas, di ba? So, pakiwari ko, ang manager na to ay Filipino. Alam niyo kung bakit? Ano yung tawag niya? Utang na loob. Ginagamit niya yung utang na loob. Pag ginano mo ito, magkakaroon ng utang na loob to sa akin at bigyan ako ng pabor or anything like that. Or something like that. As a manager, however, we have to remember that as a manager, it is within his authority to determine the interest on the debts incurred by the people. It is likely that the high interest that he put in there includes his own commission added to the supposed profit for the owner. So the manager may have already manipulated and inflated the initial figures so he gets much more, even more than the owner himself. So much of what the manager eventually deducted, let's say 50% from the olive oil and 20% from the wheat, included his expected high commission from the loan. May bago tayong member pala, no? Meron pa. So how has the reduction of the debts helped the cause of the manager? Okay. Before I go there, let's just remember that sa Mosaic law, it is unlawful for a Jew to loan money or anything with interest. Okay? Sa Jewish community, that's not allowed. So it could be that these are actually Gentiles. So that is allowed, or perhaps the Jew is sort of nagpapautang siya sa isang Gentile, kaya may mga interest na ganyan. Anyway, let's go back. So how has the reduction of the debts helped the cause of the manager who is about to lose his job? First, it would earn him great favor in the eyes of the borrowers. Diba? Secondly, it would help the borrowers pay their loans much sooner than later, which, as a result, will also be good for the master to have his money and resources back. Thirdly, and this is something very interesting, it will make the master, the overall master, appear generous and merciful toward the borrowers, for they would think it was really the master, not just the manager, being the real boss, who instructed the manager to reduce their debts. So, brilliant idea. Kasi the master actually looked good. Of course, the manager looked good, but eventually people would say, oh, siguro ito siya dito such no owner talaga. And verse 6 now, the master commended the dishonest manager because he acted shrewdly. Okay? This is the verse that sort of confuses us, because we know that the manager was really wasting, and then here's a commendation. Okay? Even the owner was obviously impressed with the way that the manager acted shrewdly. Impressed with the dishonesty of the manager? No, not at all. Remember that the manager is said to have wasted his manager's possessions. Here, the manager bluntly called him dishonest. Take note of that. The master commended the dishonest manager because he acted shrewdly. So let's not forget that. He was commending the shrewdness, but he was not commending the dishonesty. Rather, he commended his acting shrewdly, or sabihin na natin wisely. Sa Filipino term, mayroon tayong salita, maparaan. Okay? Medyo maparaan siya. Nag-iisip siya. Diba? Mayroon tayong sabihin sa taong ayaw, maraming dahilan. Sa taong may gusto, maraming paraan. The word shrewd actually means the ability to understand and judge a situation quickly and use it to one's advantage. It is being clever, matinik, okay? Mautak, perceptive, far-seeing. Actually, that's or far-sighted, which is exactly what this shrewd manager really is. That is what the master was impressed with, never the dishonesty. Let us be clear here, the parable did not say the dishonest servant was reinstated. So his dismissal from his job was carried out despite the commendation of his shrewdness. The first half of verse 8 is actually the end of the parable. The second half of verse 8 is the straightforward, human-level meaning of the parable. This is the point of the parable. Let's read it. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. So if we say it in other words, the people of the world act with better understanding and judgment with their own kind concerning worldly affairs than are the people of light, which is the disciples. Remember, he was talking to the disciples. Okay? So Jesus is telling the disciples, look, that's how they do it. And kayo parang sinasabi, you're so naive. He was actually criticizing the disciples for being too simplistic and lacking in better judgment. He wants them to act with wisdom, with shrewdness, with far-sightedness. Okay, but what is it exactly that Jesus wants them to act with better judgment about? It's not clear, the story. In what way should they act like the shrewd manager in the parable? In what way? Okay, Christ or Jesus, you want us to act wisely about what? Hindi na sinabi dun sa parable. And this is where verse 9 comes in. I tell you, and this is now the application of that lesson. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Take note again, you will be welcomed. Diba sabi nung manager kanina, that they would welcome me into their houses. Ito naman, to be welcomed into eternal dwellings. So there is a spiritual level to the parable since it talks about eternal dwellings. Jesus is making a connection with the shrewd manager who wants to be welcomed by the borrowers after he no longer has work or money. For the disciples, Jesus wants them to learn to be wise, perceptive, in understanding the use of their worldly wealth to be welcomed by their friends in heaven. Okay? Dito lang niya ginamit yung worldly wealth. So, now Jesus seems to be shifting from just the mere fact that you will be welcome, but you will be welcome through the proper use of worldly wealth. So the first understanding is to be welcome is a human level, and this one is a spiritual level of survival. So tapos sabi dito, sa next verse, as we will see, okay, verse 9. I tell you, use worldly wealth. Use worldly wealth. In a certain sense, that is actually a command. Okay? Use worldly wealth. It is an imperative. The application is that the disciples should use their worldly wealth with all discernment and far-sightedness, shrewdness, so that the kingdom of God will be welcomed by others and its cause advance on top of you being welcomed into the kingdom. The proper use of worldly wealth here on earth, to use it wisely, is the overarching lesson. The whole point of Jesus' parable. In other words, Jesus expects his disciples to be honest, to be wise, to be trustworthy in the use of their worldly riches. That is why the next verses, we read the follow-up from Jesus. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted, whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you the property of your own? So if we understand this in the light of the proper use of our resources, this makes a lot of sense. Here are the 5 things for us to consider about trustworthiness. Number 1, trustworthiness and dishonesty are opposites. Okay? If you're not trustworthy, you are dishonest. Ganun lang kasimple. Second, trustworthiness or dishonesty has nothing to do with the amount of money. It's not the amount, but the attitude of the heart. So trustworthiness, let me repeat that, has nothing to do with the amount of money, but everything to do with the attitude of the heart. Third, trustworthiness will determine whether we will even be given true riches in the future. True riches in the future. Okay. What does Jesus mean by true riches? It is most likely referring to the afterlife or entering into heaven as they know it or knew it then or understood it then. The fourth, trustworthiness is proven in what we have been given as a loan. Okay? We are first given something that is borrowed or loaned as a training for our ownership of that property that is truly ours. Trustworthiness is proven what we have been given and we already have. That eventual property of what will be ours, what is truly ours, is so precious, it demands we prove ourselves trustworthy first. Okay? Note, I'm saying trustworthy and not being worthy. Those are 2 different words. We are not worthy of anything. We are not worthy of our properties or whatever it is we have right now. But we can be trustworthy. So, not being worthy, but being trustworthy. So Jesus is teaching that all we have in this life is basically borrowed. All that we have is basically given, like a loan that is entrusted to us for our care and training and to God's credit. And lastly, trustworthiness produces increase or profit through wise management and investment. It is actually expected that there is profit, there is gain, there is more to have after we have invested. So there has to be some increase. And being trustworthy servants, increase is expected. That's why verse 13, no one can serve 2 masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. And ang ginagawa ni Jesus Christ here is now, it's the way we value the money. So after talking about being wise, or the wise use of our worldly wealth, and being honest and trustworthy, Jesus now teaches that money should not demand our loyalty, nor should it be our overriding priority. Our sole and undivided loyalty and priority must be on God. So Jesus warns about being servants of worldly wealth. This is a warning on just how easy it is to become a servant of wealth, rather than subjugate worldly wealth as a means to serve God. Use worldly wealth, as we had read kanina. And here is basically what they say, do not worship worldly wealth. Make money your servant. If we are not careful, money can deceptively and very easily become our God. We know some of the news today of how just money has become the God of so many. I just like to relate this to Colossians 3 verse 5. Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. So greed, wanting more, making money your God, is idolatry. That's what Paul says. Idolatry is having a different God, or another God beside the true God. It is breaking the first commandment. Remember also the story, the rich man? If you remember the story in Luke 18, a certain man, a certain ruler came to Jesus Christ and said, "Good teacher, what must I do to enter eternal life?" And of course, sabi ni Jesus is, you can catch him and then just release him with you? Kawawa naman. Medyo... Sabi ni Jesus Christ, you still lack one thing, because sabi nung tao is, I've done the command, I've kept all the commandments and all of that, and Jesus Christ said, you still lack one thing. Sell everything you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasures in heaven. Then come and follow me. When he heard this, you know the phrase, the rich ruler became very sad because he was very wealthy. In contemporary language, the rich man became very depressed. Sadly, money is the God of the rich ruler. There are two ways to get enough. This is by Chesterton, English writer, poet, and lay theologian. There are two ways to get enough. One is to accumulate more and more. The other is to desire less. Connecting that with what Paul has to say in Timothy, but godliness with contentment is great gain. For the love of money, this is verse 10, 1 Timothy 6, For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Money is not the root of all evil, but the love of money is. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. And we can end our discussion of the parable here. Kaya lang, somebody else heard Jesus. If I remember, he was talking to the disciples primarily. And pero tapos na yung lesson eh. Actually, this is basically the lesson for the disciples in that parable. Kaya lang, in verse 14, the Pharisees, may umiksena dito, the Pharisees who love money heard all this and were sneering at Jesus. He said to them, you are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of the others, but God knows your hearts. What people value highly is detestable in God's sight. So the Pharisees heard all that Jesus said to his disciples. And their reaction was they sneered at him. Alam niyo yung sneer? Turn your nose up. Yeah? Alam niyo yung reaction? Parang... Hirap. Nagtawag niyo sa Pilipino? Hirap. Oo. It's a prideful contempt. If you do that, you're trying to make yourself higher than the other person. It's pride. They belittled, put down Jesus, because the Pharisees, as we read here, or as Luke wrote it, the Pharisees loved money. They were just wealthy. They loved money. Outwardly, Pharisees are models of righteousness and religiosity. They, however, loved and served money more than they served God, and more than they loved God. And that's what Jesus saw in their hearts. The Pharisees have somehow equated wealth with blessings and God's favor. To them, if you're healthy, if you're wealthy, you are blessed. And even now we have the health, wealth gospel. So we need to be careful with that. So the Pharisees equated wealth with God's favor and blessing. And because of it, they have become spiritually proud and blinded by the worldly wealth, not seeing the true source of eternal wealth, which is Jesus himself. Can you see that? The irony? Jesus was right there. The Pharisees are here. What blinds them from seeing Jesus? Wealth. Wealth. And the true source of heavenly wealth is right there in front of them. Yet Jesus says God knows what's inside their hearts. And all they value worldly riches with the prestige, praise, adoration from the people, and everything else that comes with it, to God they are detestable. What people value highly is detestable in God's sight. Detestable is God will absolutely reject that. These are strong words of condemnation from Jesus himself. And Jesus followed it with this, again, very difficult to understand passage in the light of how Luke arranged this material. The law and the prophets were proclaimed until John. Since that time, the good news of the kingdom of God is being preached, and everyone is forcing their way into it. It is easier for heaven and earth to disappear than for the last stroke of men to jump out of the law. Anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery. The man who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So how are we going to understand this in the light of Jesus actually talking about basically resource, worldly, of money, and the value we need to, how we need to value money? In these three verses, Jesus is illustrating just how much the Pharisees have missed the whole intent and fulfillment of the law and the prophets. Remember, they were blinded in who really Jesus is. And the whole point of the law is actually Jesus himself. He is the King of the kingdom of the scriptures that they knew then. He proclaimed the good news. He is the gospel. However, instead of the Pharisees happily submitting to him, they constantly questioned and rejected his authority over them. What is meant then by forcing their way into it? Okay? This forcing their way into it, and everyone is forcing their way into it. It's not clear in this particular passage, but if we look at Matthew's rendering of this, from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been subjected to violence, and violent people have been raiding it. Okay? So, I think this one is a little bit clearer, because if we understand the context, he was really talking to the disciples, it could mean that the Pharisees were actually attacking and subjecting Christ's gospel and his kingdom to violence. For seeing Jesus as a threat, the Pharisees attacked him violently. Jesus, even then, everything will be fulfilled. Okay? They were attacking him because they think that he just does not represent the Christ, the prophesied Christ that they expected. Okay? So they rejected him. But Jesus Christ saying, look, the law that you believe in is me, is here. And remember, subjecting to violence or attacking violently, Christ died a violent death because of the plan of the Pharisees. So it makes sense if we understand that this way. As to the issue of divorce, Jesus cites this as an example of the Pharisees' rejection of the true intent of the law. Jesus, really, the author of the law, wants couples to remain in marriage and not divorce. Though divorce was permitted, it was not encouraged. The way the Pharisees applied it instead resulted in adultery. Now let's go to the second parable, which I think is very much connected, is intricately connected with this one. Remember, again, first talk with the disciples. Narinig ng mga Pharisees, they reacted, and so Christ also reacted, and He tells another parable. Okay? So the parable of the rich man and the Lazarus is primarily addressed to the Pharisees. It is them that He is talking to. The story illustrates the serious consequences of the attitudes of the Pharisees if they do not change their ways. Let's quickly read through the story, as this parable is important in the way we understand the whole of chapter 16. The time came when the beggar died, the angels carried him to Abraham's side. I'm sorry, I went ahead. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and lived in luxury every day. At his gate was a lame beggar named Lazarus. Interesting, Lazarus is the name. The beggar, the rich man, didn't have a name. Okay? At his gate was a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. The rich man was covered with fine linen, purple, royal purple, but this beggar was covered in sores. Longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table, even the dogs came and licked his sores. You know how dogs are if they do that. The time came when the beggar died and the angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried, where he was in Hades. Also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was in torment, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. So he called to him, Father Abraham, have pity on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I am in agony in this life. Made me think, could this poor beggar actually have called on the rich man when they were living and said, could you please dip your finger in mine, in your whatever it is in my tongue to relieve me? Kumbaga ay parang ganun ang nakikita ko dito. Okay? Because I am in agony in this fire. But Abraham replied, Son, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things, while the Lazarus received bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. And besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been set in place, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to us. He pleaded again, answered, Then I beg you, Father, please send Lazarus to my family, for I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them, so that they will not also come to this place of torment. Abraham replied, They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them. Remember Moses and the prophets, the law and the prophets. No, Father Abraham, he said, but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent. Seems to say that all of his brothers were as rich as he is. He said to him, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. Notice that Lazarus is a poor beggar with nothing to live on, and on top of that, very sick. In fact, he died first. People don't like to get near him because they might also get whatever, skin disease he might have. And remember, sick people are often considered as cursed or being punished by God. Every day, the hungry and weak beggar longs for the tiny crumbs to eat, while the rich man lives in luxury every day. But when they both died, there was a reversal of the status. The two men, Lazarus, being welcomed into the eternal dwellings with Abraham, while the rich man was tormented in hell. If you consider the parable of the prodigal son, there was also a reversal of status. The themes of the use of money being welcome is common in all three parables, as the way you arranged them. Let me remind ourselves that in this whole chapter, Jesus is talking about the proper use and regard of our worldly resources. He is illustrating by such stories as these parables that God would like His people to use their riches wisely. We cannot use these teachings, however, or these images to relate them to entering heaven or hell, or how these might actually look like in reality. Money or wealth in itself is neither wrong or evil. Money helps provide for our daily needs. Provision for ourselves is important. Look, that's a given. When you have your money, it serves you. Okay? God does not want us to be beggars. And that's not the point of this story either. Doesn't want us to be Lazarus, to be a beggar. Okay? However, we see in the parable that when man's loyalty and soul security is on money, which is exactly what the Pharisees are, he becomes independent, self-absorbed, and self-sufficient. He trusts less and less in God, and God no longer takes a central role in his life. Someone who is so preoccupied with money becomes callous to other people who are not as wealthy as he is. The poor people become like mere animals, or as in the case of Lazarus, less than a dog. For the dog, at least, it's what is fitting for a dog. The poor beggar eats dog food and does it under the table. This implies that the rich man really considers himself very high and never offered the poor beggar a decent meal to eat, or a cold drink perhaps. How low can a poor Lazarus get in the eyes of the rich man? So very low indeed. In the eyes of the rich man, preoccupied with wealth, poor men don't even exist. They are nothing. The moral in the story is not that. The moral of the story is not in how much we earn that will give us favor in God's eyes, but how much we have spent what we were given in service of our fellow men. The Pharisees loved money deeply. God despises their love of money deeply also. In reality, God does not need our money. Think about that. God doesn't need our money. Other people need our money. Okay? Man cannot take his wealth with him when he dies. God instead wants us to love our fellow men and show it with what we have, with our worldly wealth. We love God by loving our fellow man. We serve God with our money by using it to serve our fellow men. Money is supposed to be our servant to further both the kingdom of God and further the welfare of our fellow men in need. This way, we are welcomed, we are accepted, and considered as God's own children and faithful stewards. I say that the path to heaven is made by laying down our worldly wealth, walking on them, and never coming back to pick them up again. You can't take your riches when you die. But in case you're imagining, oh, when I die, I can take my riches with me. If that's what you think, then this is how you would look. Yeah, you can take your wealth when you die, but that's why you look. So, what then are the practical ways we can apply the principles of the proper use of money and worldly wealth? There are two broad examples from our parables. One is we love God by the use of our resources. So, how do we use our money to express our love for God? Yung sa unang parable ni Jesus Christ, it's about providing for the needs of support for the preaching of the gospel. And this is in terms of our tithes and offerings to support church-related ministries, missions, for example, facilities, or, as in our case, hopefully our church building very soon. So we thank Kuya Ed for this, because this is exactly how his heart is, I believe. He's willing to spend much of what he has for the love of God and for the furtherance of the gospel. Number two, as in the case of the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, how do we use our money to express our love for our neighbors? By donations and emergency assistance, as it is right now. Right now, we ought to give sacrificially to the devastated typhoon victims in any way we can. I hope we're not callous that when we see the pictures on televisions, the videos, we see children see their eyes, that we are not touched. We should be. There's suffering, all of the victims of Typhoon Haiyan or Yolanda. I just don't like to use Yolanda kasi meron tayong and we must have been very siguro kasi but Haiyan, for example, all of them, they be suffering from sort of physical need, physical want, physical suffering, psychological suffering, trauma, emotional distress that really are unspeakable. Just realizing how much they have gone through, losing family and loved ones, losing homes. Saan sila babalik? Where's their security now? And having all the little that they have completely wiped out. I ask us, can anybody really understand the suffering that they're going through? Remember the story of Job? How he lost his family? All of them are like Job's. Think about that for me. Seeing the extent and loss, the damage, the hunger, the thirst, the cries, and silent tears, it made me realize one thing. And I'm a little bit disappointed to admit this, but I realized that I know almost nothing of what the word suffering really means. Thank God Jesus understands because He took the fullness of our suffering in His humanity. I urge all of us then to act, to give, even perhaps sell what we don't need anymore, so that we have something to share, to give to our poor beggars, literally beggars. We can be extraordinary in the sharing our wealth for the sake of our suffering fellow men. Love in action. Just like what the song said, God is enough for us. In conclusion, brethren, the followers of Jesus are instructed to use worldly wealth or worldly riches wisely for God's glory and not make it their all-consuming priority. We are called to be wise stewards with the various resources God has bestowed upon us. All of us have some sort of material blessing, material wealth, and resources. Some have more, some have less, but all of us have something. But as we have learned today, Jesus expects us to be trustworthy servants. He wants us to be wise in the use of our resources so we can profit and benefit others through our assistance and tangible care. And lastly, He wants us not to trust money, but regard it as a servant for God. Let us then be good stewards of Jesus, investing on heavenly wealth as we set our affection on things above, Jesus Himself as our true treasure. For He will provide for all that we truly need. He is the one we can trust. He is our true wealth. And as Jesus also says in Luke 12:32-34, this is going to be our final two verses. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be